today. I'm very happy to welcome you to the JCPA Professional Training webinar with Doug Kahn to introduce you to our new JCPA Professional Training Guide. JCPA has made professional development for the field one of the major priorities. This comprehensive guide that we created is to help ensure that the field has access to a solid base of knowledge of the foundation of the community relations field, that we have best practices, that we can help you handle difficult situations, have robust conversations and consensus building with your boards, and more. The first time we used this guide was with a newish directors retreat that was held in February, and we have tweaked it for usage of new and professional alike. We are very happy to see so many people interested in participating in this webinar. And we are encouraging everyone to have the resource guide with them. We hope that you've downloaded it for this purpose already, but if you haven't, you can have access to it in the dashboard right here on the webinar. It's under handouts. You should see the number 1. If you click on that, you can download the resource guide and follow along. Before I turn the floor over to Doug, I have a few announcements. If you are logged onto the computer, but you're using your phone for audio, please enter your audio PIN that's also on the dashboard under audio. If you are using your computer for sound, you don't need to do anything. We will also be taking Q&A as we go along in different sections. We would like for this to be interactive, and you can post your questions also in the dashboard. We will be bundling the questions together and taking them at different sections. So Doug, I'd like to turn this over to you, and thank you so much for all your time and great work on this initiative.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to everybody who attended. I'm sure none of you thought you got enough reminders about this seminar today. So delighted to be participating. I know many of you, or most of you, of course, from my 34 years at the JCRC in San Francisco, and I've really been thrilled to work with JCPA in large part because of the fact that they have made strengthening the field and supporting professional development such a priority, and it's been an honor to work with David and Melanie and Haya, who have been so supportive in that arena. I feel like on a topic like going through a professional training guide, it would probably work best if I did it to the tunes of Hamilton. That's probably not in the cards, but I do hope that it will be engaging and that you'll have lots of questions, either based on things I say or things that I don't say. Let me start very briefly before we turn to the guide itself with an overview, and say that one of the reasons why I think it's significant to have a guide is, first of all, because even though we're in 120-something different communities, that we come in all shapes and sizes, there are very common threads to the work that we do. Whether we're a large JCRC, a small JCRC, an independent, an in-house, we come from a red state or a blue state, we are fundamentally concerned with the same mission of safeguarding the conditions under which Jews as a community and individuals can flourish here and abroad. Our work is fundamentally similar, even though our priorities may differ community to community, and the demands on us as professionals are similar regardless of what kind of community and structure we come in from. And therefore, having a guide is a way of reminding us that we're all in this together, that we have a shared literature, that we have a shared purpose, and that we have a shared not encyclopedia, I guess I would say a shared compendium of best practices that we can draw upon. That's the first reason why a guide. The second reason, I think, for having a guide is simply because of the fact that we are, as professionals, that you who are doing this every day are so consumed by those priorities that you plan to focus on a given day, and all those issues that suddenly arise that you didn't even plan on. And the question is, how do you make sure that you have the time to deal with the basics of the operation that undergird how strong the JCRC will be to take on the huge demands for the community. And so the ability to focus on what may seem mundane, the organizational structures, the professional practices, the policies, internal policies, is actually, by providing that kind of information as a go-to, can hopefully help enhance the work that you're doing on a daily basis. So it's really a recognition of how unbelievably time-consuming the work is and demanding that the work is that everyone is doing. Thirdly, frankly, I think having the guide is a statement to those outside the field, in the federation world and the like, about how seriously the field takes its work and the area of professional development. And the fact that there hadn't been a guide for many years was clearly noticeable as a gap that had to be filled. So for all these reasons, I think it's important that a guide has been developed. The next thing I want to say is that how you use the guide, I think, also makes a difference. I want to encourage people, I know it's 200+ pages, to print out at least a copy, to put it in a three-ring binder, or more precisely, to put it into 2 3-ring binders. Binder 1 is those pages that you know are most relevant to you, the stuff that you need your JCRC to be able to work on and that you as a professional want to work on. And the second binder, which may be much larger, is all the other auxiliary stuff that's good to read, but may not be as pertinent on a day-to-day basis. I think it can be very useful to have it at your fingertips. I think you'll refer to it often. And on top of that, many JCRCs develop internal policies. For example, recently, when to issue a statement, when not to issue a statement. Your internal policies belong in that 3-ring binder that includes the most pertinent information from this guide. The reason it's intended as a 3-ring binder kind of guide, if that's not too old-fashioned to say, is because it should change. It should be a living, breathing document that we will add to, that new relevant materials can be brought and added to it over time. So who should use the guide? JCRC directors, other professionals that you think would be important to have it, maybe your lay leaders. We've already gotten some feedback from lay leaders who have seen it that they find it very, very valuable. So let me finally say, before we go to the guide, that if there's something that you can't find that you think is important, that we missed, that you'll let Melanie or me know, and we will see about adding new material. For example, we've recently been working on a packet for new JCRCs. We may have in the next year 6, 7 new JCRCs from Oklahoma City to Vermont, which is absolutely thrilling for the field and a recognition of how important the work of CRCs is. And we're developing a starter kit for new CRCs. Some of that material may be relevant for long-standing CRCs as well. The guide itself is what I will call a twofer. It starts with the entire book that Stephen Windmuller, who was the longtime director of the JCRC in LA, put together, and also grows from his academic background as the head of the School of Communal Service at Hebrew Union College. And it's out of print, but he gave us permission to use his entire guide. And then we have a whole additional supplementary section which includes materials drawn from our experiences and also includes material both from the independent JCRC and the Committee of Federation models, so that everyone should hopefully find things that will be useful for them in the guide. So with that introduction, and again encouraging you to send your questions to Melanie, I'd love to literally spend the bulk of the time walking through the guide with you today. And I'm going to refer to pages and hopefully will, in a sense, be on the same page when I do. So let me very briefly and breezily walk through some of Steve Windmuller's materials. And you saw even from the article that he wrote in E-Jewish Philanthropy this week that Melanie shared with the field that Stephen continues to think actively about how to strengthen the field for years to come. And some of his theoretical and academic efforts in this book I think are very important before we get to the practical section. So I just want to very briefly highlight some of the pages that for me are the go-to pages in his section. And this is from his part, which is the You Shall Not Stand Idly By, a Jewish Community Relations Workbook section of the overall guide. So the first is starting on page 23, which is the role of the professional in the field. And I was struck by the fact that this was based on the fact that the Association of Jewish Community Relations Workers was formed in 1950, and at the time they described the characteristics of what the field should look like, the qualifications of Jewish community relations workers, the scope of responsibility, the training and the experience, and I found it very, very useful in many cases. So for example, it says here that the professional Jewish community relations worker exercises his or her skills not as an individual, but according to the policies and resources of an agency whose program he or she interprets, supports, and executes. In other words, it refers to that balancing act between our personal sense of responsibility and our personal sense of values and our professional sense of responsibility, and that if we're going to succeed in the field, we have to be able to develop strategies to figure out how to maintain that ability to reach across all major audiences without seeming as if we are biased in our own views, and yet we are also human beings who have strong passions about various issues. Indeed, it's that passion that drove us to the field in the first place. So it's just one of the pearls that I found in this section. And another one is on Jewish background on page 26, where he talks about having respectful regard for all forms and expressions of Jewish life and a commitment to the preservation of American Jewry as a distinctive group. As I often say to people, I think what's important is not that somebody be a learned Jew, but rather that somebody have authenticity as a deeply caring, involved Jew, whether that person comes from any particular denomination or not. And again, one of the things that enriches our field so much is the diversity in every sense of our professionals. Diverse in terms of religious background, diverse in terms of academic background, diverse in terms of community-based experience, diverse in terms of Jewish expression, diverse in every sense of the word. Maybe not quite as diverse ideologically, but even there's certainly a wide range of views that can be found. Continuing on in his section, I thought that one of the nice pieces is on page 99, the ingredients of community building, where he talks about some of the key principles. For example, the ability to organize, the capacity to manage the core issues of the community, the desire to engage in thoughtful debate and planned action, the quality of resiliency and tenacity to follow through with serious implementation, and the sense of historic purpose or mission. And the way in which Stephen envisions it, and I would say I envision it, is that it's not pick and choose from this, it's the collective of the weight of all five of these combined that makes us uniquely qualified to be effective in our pursuit of the community relations agenda on behalf of our community. So again, some very valuable tips, I think, in this section. You continue to page 106, you will see principles of organizing and advocacy, which I think is basic, and yet again, always good to remind who are our primary target audiences in the external community. You know, one of the things that I think has happened in my tenure at JCRC in San Francisco and across the country is that when I started out, I'd say 90% of the time that JCRC spent was on the external community and 10% on educating and mobilizing the Jewish community. Today it's probably 50-50, maybe it's even tipped more, but the amount of attention that the Jewish community requires is tremendous. Reading this section is a reminder of how important it is to maintain that commitment to the external environment, given that we are only 2% of the population and have to multiply our impact. and a lot of how-tos in terms of how to achieve that. By the way, one of my rules of thumb is if every CRC professional just had one outreach meeting a week with a new contact, that's 52 a year. And I know it's like, where do we find the time? But this section is a reminder of how critically important it is. The next section is the first one that we're going to put on the screen on decision-making processes on page 111 in the book. And I think you can see if you scroll down, hopefully that's possible, toward the bottom of that page. And you will see that it talks about what are the thoughts that should go into how decisions are made. And again, I'm not going to dwell on this in detail, but just to look at the shape of it. What does Jewish law and tradition offer us? Maybe that's one of the considerations. What has been Jewish communal service and past practice, experience and past practice? Who are the primary stakeholders, both within the community and outside of it, that can or ought to be affected by policy outcomes? And if you continue through this section, you will see something about the 4 types of community relations actions on page 112. And then you'll see different decision-making models on the next page. And it's a reminder about the nimble quality of our work at JCRCs. That, you know, one of our mantras, I guess, at our JCRC was that even when we cannot achieve consensus on an issue, it does not mean there's no role for us. Maybe the role is to identify Jewish organizations that can take a lead on that issue. So, for example, if we don't have a consensus on capital punishment, but the reform movement and NCJW do, then maybe they can be that voice of the Jewish community organizations on that set of issues. Or we don't have a consensus and we develop an educational packet and study programs. I think this section can be very, very helpful in terms of thinking through the processes and also determining what are the kinds of issues that rise to the top and why do they rise to the top? What is the standard or the bar that we should have in place so that you're not constantly debating, is this a Jewish issue? Is this not a Jewish issue? How do we arrive at that decision? So that's what this section is about. Continuing on, just a couple of other areas. You will see that on page 114, there's defining what is a Jewish issue. And then one of my favorite of his part is on page 115, making meetings work, which we'll also take a look at. The reason I want to call attention to this is that in recent years, there's been so much discussion about whether Generation X, millennials, will come to monthly meetings. Are JCRCs that still have monthly meetings able to attract top quality leadership? Are there new models that can be considered? And what I love about this section is the very first question it basically asks, but on page 115 near the bottom in italics, is this meeting necessary? And so going through a section like this can help as you evolve your JCRC's structural decision making in terms of looking at, do you have the right kinds of structures in place to really deliver the goods in terms of the community relations work that you are charged with in your community? Or should the structures be adapted given whatever factors, that people don't like to come to a monthly meeting anymore, that you're really not spending the time developing consensus, they're more informational meetings, maybe that time might be better spent in another kind of way. So it's just something that I would strongly encourage you to give consideration to as you work through the packet. Inevitably, there's a section on page 119 on what is consensus. Consensus is, when I started in the field, my mentor and predecessor, Earl Rabb, said, you know consensus when you've got it. And that wasn't good enough by the time our community was more split on issues. So we developed a means by which, consensus is 75% of the final vote, and interim votes require a majority, that is amendments and the like. But everybody should sort of think through how consensus is defined within their community and whether that definition still holds. So again, a very useful section there. And then just a couple of others. There's a section on best practices on page 121 It talks about knowledge and recognition and networking and confidentiality and the bottom line and visioning, all extremely valuable for the professionals in our field. I think that the only other reference I'll make to the Steve Windmuller portion before I get to the very practical part, two more. One is on page 144, 10 factors for building an effective community relations agency, starting with remaining focused on the core agenda, understanding at times that the agency faces competing community relations objectives, building relationships everywhere, etc. Very valuable 10 factors for building an effective community relations agency. And there's a lovely section on page 148 on constructing a leadership profile, and then continuing on creating your leadership toolbox. So these are some of the areas that I found to move from being what I'll call academic to really practical. And then it concludes on page 204 with a set of propositions for Jewish advocacy, Appendix A, which is kind of very dense, but I think very valuable to have the opportunity to go through all of it. It was constructed by my mentor, Earl Rabb, who was the dean of the field, and then ultimately the first director of the Perlmutter Institute for Jewish Advocacy at Brandeis University, and I highly commend that for you. Melody, I don't know if there are any questions that have been forthcoming yet, but I want to pause there before we go into the meat of the practical material that we've developed. That's the second part of this.
Hi, Doug. There are no questions at this time.
Okay. Well, I'm going to forge ahead, but I would love to have the opportunity to hear Melanie's voice interrupting me with questions. So I strongly encourage folks to let us know what their questions are. So in the practical material, now we're starting on the bottom of the guide. It will say the page number, and the very first one is page 211 that I want to call your attention to. I was actually asked to I was asked to talk about the historical connection of our field. Where does Jewish community relations come from? And this is based on a speech I did that grounds community relations in terms of Jewish historical experience. I want to say my own approach to these things is you want to use this, you want to attribute, great. You don't want to attribute, I don't care. If it strengthens your JCRC to remind folks of the fact that the work is grounded in Jewish history, please, please feel free to use it. I have to say, I think there are many enjoyable kinds of examples, going from Peter Stuyvesant, who didn't want to let Jews into New Amsterdam, to the appeal to Abraham Lincoln when Jews were going to be expelled from certain territories. And you'll see it's rich with that kind of material. So I highly recommend your feeling free to steal and use that and other documents. The first one we're going to look at is the core values on page 221. So at the time at our JCRC was probably 60 years old. We did maybe the first ever formal strategic planning process. And our strategic planning consultant said, what are your core values? And we kind of gave the standard response that had been given over years, which was, you know, Jewish values underlie our work, but we don't really spell them out. And he said, I think you should. And that has been something that we've come back to again and again. So this is from our JCRC's effort to identify what are the core values that permeate Jewish community relations work. And when you look at it, it's a wow. It's a wow. These are not obscure, and they are not, you know, you don't have to, they're not a stretch either. Tikkun Olam is something everybody knows about. Darchei Shalom is something that I like to talk about because I actually think it defines precisely what our field is. Darchei Shalom is a Talmudic idea that when we help non-Jews along with Jews, we are doing it for the sake of community peace. It's literally a Talmudic requirement that we feed and clothe non-Jews along with the Jews. Mipnei Darchei Shalom. In other words, enlightened self-interest. If that doesn't define our world, those two together, Tikkun Olam and Darchei Shalom, I'm not sure what does. And so the ability to say how authentic our work is in terms of it being grounded in Jewish values can be a huge strengthening agent for JCRCs. We had others, of course, that all Israel is responsible for one another. All are created in God's image. Do not stand idly by. Hillel's saying, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? My experience at JCRC was that the people who came around our table were people who were drawn either because their first passion was the particularistic agenda, like Israel, anti-Semitism, Soviet Jewry at the time, and they recognized that in order to be impactful, we needed to be involved in a broader set of issues, and people whose passion was Tikkun Olam, but understood that we couldn't abandon the particularistic needs of the community at the same time. And we are strengthened by that mix. These values absolutely validate that mix. Now, I'm not suggesting that you simply copy ours, though you can. I'm suggesting that the exercise of going through that can be invaluable for a JCRC. The next one I want to look at, and I do, again, encourage you to send questions in, is on page 223. This is a document that will show you that I did up for the training of newish CRC professionals. And for me, it answers the question that we get asked all the time. What are the key functions, or put it differently, a JCRC's unique role? And I'm not going to read all of them, but I want to highlight a few. Obviously, the first one, to educate and advocate on the issues of vital concern, to serve as the representative body that approximates what we call the organized Jewish community, and that enables us to both protect and define the broad tent, to hold the center, nuanced, impactful activism, while balancing the two sides of the issues ledger, to be the one-stop shop for managing the community relations issues that arise in the Jewish community, to serve as the exemplar of civil discourse in our community, and on and on. So I want to say that you may look at these and say, well, that doesn't really pertain to our JCRC. But I'll submit that I think the overwhelming majority do, even if it's not always explicit. And in any event, you can pull out of this that question when your federation exec, when your top lay leaders in the city, in the community, are saying, why does JCRC play a unique role? Here are some of the unique roles that JCRCs do play or can play that are vitally important for the entirety of the community. The next page I want to turn to is on page 233. 233 is, what are the basic responsibilities of nonprofit boards? Now, again, recognizing that we come in all shapes and sizes, that a number of JCRCs don't have their independent board-making authority. But nevertheless, every JCRC has something that it calls a council, a board, an executive committee. They are all, using different, that we use different kinds of terms. But this is a kind of classic description of basic responsibilities of nonprofit boards, and it's followed by an outstanding set of recommended governance practices on the next series of pages. So I wanted to specifically call it out for your attention, in the hope that for many of you it will be a relevant document. Again, I'm going to pause and say, Melanie, are there any questions yet?
Yep, we have one question.
Okay, great.
There has been a lot written recently about the changing nature and need for JCRCs. In light of this, do you see any reason to think about the material in the guide differently?
I'm sorry, you said a lot about the nature of JCRCs going forward?
Sure. Yeah.
I think that the guide was already, when we started this guide, which was just really finished before the most recent JCPA conference, we already had in mind this ongoing discussion about what should be the role of JCRCs going forward, and with a historical view that there were years when JCRCs were given substantial resources, and then we can argue about when the date is. I will say at the end of the Oslo process in 2000, when the beginning of the Oslo process in 2000, when we were going to have peace in our time. The Soviet Jewry movement, as we knew it, which the CRCs had played such an important role in, had effectively ended and moved into, how do you absorb so many hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews, and anti-Semitism was at its lowest point ever. And therefore, there was this assessment in the American Jewish community that we should turn away from external challenges and focus on internal challenges like intermarriage and Jewish education and identity. And, that went until 2000. And then in 2000, the Second Intifada began. And then we have a whole range of experiences in communities. And I think we view this moment, so I'm going to put it in these terms, we view this as an extraordinarily opportune moment for JCRCs. And one of the reasons I think the timing of the guide is particularly good is because JCRCs are poised, in our opinion, to experience a resurgence of interest, in part because federations have seen all over the country now what the polarization is doing to them, to the community, and they recognize that JCRCs may play a critically important role as the exemplars of civil discourse, in part because after the November election, there's a recognition that the Jewish community has to be more fully present in the broader community than was granted prior to that time in the last number of years. So we think that it's an extraordinarily opportune time, and in fact, as I mentioned, there are around 7 new JCRCs that are emerging. That's a statement of itself. So we hope this will actually strengthen the case for JCRCs. Now, a lot has been written, for example, in Steve Windmuller's recent article about the emergence over time of single-issue organizations, of new style organizations. I think all of that is relevant for JCRCs to consider in terms of structural models itself. So there's an elasticity built into this manual. It doesn't say that a JCRC should have the conventional style of structure with the national Jewish organizations that are all members of the JCPA and not reach out to new organizations that are out there. It does give guidance in terms of how to strengthen JCRCs, but that nimble quality, that elastic quality, is inherently built into the guide. So the question, for example, is if you have a community that has seen many new Jewish organizations emerge, like Stand With Us, like local Jewish environmental groups, like many other, a kind of range of new organizations, can this guide still be helpful? I would say absolutely. The professionalism, the building of that sort of track record of professional experience can only be helpful in terms of building relationships with these new groups. They may not come into JCRC in the same kind of membership model as historically happened, but there may be new kinds of partnerships that are forged. So I hope that's responsive. The person who asked that question can also email me afterwards, and I'd be happy to continue that conversation. So now I'm on page 239, and I just want to say that this is a phenomenal manual that was put together on lay and professional relationships that we included in there. What is Jewish about lay leaders and professionals working together? And it's just a wonderful document that I encourage you to look at and to use as you see fit. I'm struck by the fact that in my 34 years at JCRC, we actually spent remarkably little time talking about lay professional relationships. I think on the one hand, that's probably a good sign in terms of it not usually kind of dominating the space. Sure, there are always war stories out there, but but it never felt like the dominant subject matter at our conferences or among our colleagues. And yet, inevitably, there are questions around the best practices for lay professional relationships. So I commend this section to you. And I would say that one thing that sort of permeates the guide is how to consistently look for and recruit top-level lay leaders for the JCRC. And I'm hoping that the kinds of tools that we've already talked about will be useful, because I do think one of the issues that does exist is whether or not JCRCs are able to actively recruit the people with the greatest gravitas in terms of communal leadership for active involvement within JCRCs. And if there are things that are deterring that or attracting that involvement, always something to consider. So again, this is kind of a prompt for thinking that through. The next section that I will call attention to is on page 277. And Melanie, I actually don't know if you want to mention a word about it, but I thought it was important to call out this section, which starts on that page. But these are a series of documents that Melanie put together, I think in part for her successor, but they really spell out the functions of the JCRC, of the various committees of the JCRC, and the overall structure. And I want to mention it because, again, I know many of the CRCs are committees of the Federation, as is the one in Metro West. So, Melanie, I don't know if you want to add a word on that, but I did want to commend that section as well to folks.
Sure. We included this section. When I put these materials together, I did a lot of research regarding how different JCRCs were organized. So this should not only reflect Greater Metro West, but kind of like the mainstream of how majority of JCRCs who have 1 or 2 or 2.5 staff organize themselves, who are departments of federations. In this part of the kit, we have the structure of the JCRC, subcommittees, how to function well within a federated system, how to work with the different agencies within the federation system as well. With there's a focus on government affairs, Israel and world affairs, and social action and community involvement.
Great. And, you know, again, I want to say, and I hope this is okay to speak for you on this part, Melanie, but if it's useful to lift entire portions, feel free to do so.
Absolutely. That's why I included it. A lot of the questions that I get now that I'm at JCPA are on these exact issues, and I hope that this information is useful, especially if there are many JCRCs right now that are rethinking how they're organized, you know, how their committee structure should be. They're trying to figure out how to be more impactful within the federated systems within which they work. So I hope that these charts are useful when you're making your argument about the importance of your government affairs work, your policy work, your interfaith group work. It's important to show the federated system through charts and stats and other, you know, ways that they measure how we do our work to show how you fit in. So I hope that this is helpful, and please use it, and I'm always available to help.
By the way, Melanie, you actually just gave, and this is for everyone, of course, this is not a two-way conversation here, but you just gave me an idea of an additional piece that we should add, which is how do JCRCs evaluate their effectiveness, an evaluation tool. So I think that would be great to add, and we will do that. I'm now going to ask, the camera will put us onto page 289, JCRC Board of Directors Responsibilities. And if we can go to that, that would be great. And again, this is a 3-page document that is divided into 2 sections. One section is on what the board responsibility is as a board, and the next section is the leadership expectations and role of individual members of the board of the JCRC. So you don't have a board, and you're a committee of the Federation, and my response to that is you still have an entity that, as lay leaders, is charged with being the lay body for JCRC? Has it gone through a process of owning what their responsibilities are, to show up at meetings, to be financial supporters, to be ambassadors in the community, to engage in whatever fiduciary responsibilities your JCRC has? So I encourage you strongly to look at this section. Again, it's not a matter so much of, yes, we're going to adopt this as ours, it's absolutely terrific, but going through a process with your lay leadership to own what they agree is their responsibility. So the fact that they themselves said to make JCRC a top volunteer and philanthropic priority, to regularly attend and actively participate in board, council, and committee meetings, to stay up to date and be able to articulate the JCRC's mission, purpose, policies, programs, and services, strengths, and needs. All of these things are critically important to your magnifying your impact. We are professionals. We need, and we are paid for doing the work. We need our lay leaders to be the real champions for JCRC on an ongoing basis. We found this document to be extremely useful, and obviously, even though it was adopted 7 years ago, it's now been absorbed and accepted by each subsequent board of directors. So to make it your own for sure, but to have a document that's tailored for your community, I think can be very, very important. I'm just going to say one more time that we have 15 minutes left. I have 2 more documents I'm going to briefly share. So I really hope there are a couple more questions because I would love to be able to answer any more questions that are out there. So the next page, which is on 297, is strategic planning template for JCRCs defining their core mission. And I just want to highlight this. This was done by David Bernstein, who's a master in this area. This, I think, was done as a template based on work he did with the Atlanta Jewish community. But it can be extraordinarily helpful and, frankly, what I would say is a streamlined way without thinking that strategic planning is a process that will take 9 months and 2 professional consultants and a whole industry. That there are ways to really zero in on what is at the essence of your JCRC, what are the top priorities of your JCRC, what are essentially, it also includes a form of a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And I really think that it can be a very useful document, and you can certainly reach out to David for additional information on how to implement it. The very last page is something I did for the professional training. So we're now at page 303. And it's one thing, actually, I think I originally did it as my sort of swan song at the CRC Professionals meeting, where they said, anything you want to impart before you retire? And I said, sure. Here are my thoughts from my years of experience from the time at JCRC. And I want to share this with folks here to indicate that that maybe some of these could be useful. For example, the fact that we affect people's lives and that we should tell their stories is something that struck me over the years. We're so issue-driven that sometimes when we talk about the issues, they may or may not resonate with the community. But when we tell the story of when we helped address an issue in a particular school, when a parent called and their child was somehow disadvantaged because she was Jewish, and we sort of paint that picture, we're going to have a dramatic impact on people. Similarly, to think expansively about what it means to be the community relations experts for the community. We in San Francisco positioned ourselves so that whenever any Jewish institution faces a community relations issue, a sensitive one, a tragedy at a summer camp, and the outside media is suddenly calling off, the phone calls are off the hook, a synagogue that went through an embezzlement and knows that the media is going to be there any minute. Whatever those issues are, including the Federation struggling in a period of polarization, to the extent that JCRCs can position themselves as being the first call, it enhances our stature in the community tremendously. To only hire can-do staff and to never settle. I mean, these are just some of my, I'm just giving you 3 of the examples from here that I think have helped, that I've learned over the years. And maybe a final one, because I've already alluded to it. Oh, 2 final ones. Develop a reasonably thick skin. People just don't rip up angry letters anymore. And most of the passion is because people really do care about the issues and JCRC's role in addressing them. And remembering every single day to go home and say, not, damn, I can't believe I got that horrific email, but what were the amazingly important things that I felt good about today. And to be able to develop that thick skin, I don't think I was naturally a thick-skinned person, but I sure think that developing that thick skin over time helps tremendously. And then explicitly assert the Jewish values that inform and motivate our work, which I talked about already. Again, it doesn't require someone to be a knowledgeable, learned Jew, but that authenticity, that what we do derives from long-standing, real Jewish values and is not taken from thin, as well as Jewish historical experience, is something that I think is very important and often not taught, historically was not talked about, and therefore there's a really golden opportunity to do that. And then, of course, finally, I guess, plausible deniability, giving JCRC the freedom to be edgy at times so that it can build authentic and meaningful bridges with other communities, needs greater respect in Jewish life. And I say that as somebody who consistently, when I have the opportunity to speak to the Federation field, remind them that federations are best protected when that kind of plausible deniability exists. Because if federations can deflect some of the heat onto JCRC, that's in part what we're there for. And actually, federations value our work even more when they can do that. So let me pause there, see if there are any more questions. But that is a very quick walkthrough through the highlights of the guide to the non-tune of Hamilton, and I'm grateful, of course, for everybody being on the call. Melanie, any questions?
There are no questions at this time. I did get a comment that this was very helpful, and that's West Hartford may use for JCRC board trainings and future board orientations.
Great. Well, I just want to summarize, and if there's any more questions, you'll let me know in the last 3-4 minutes. I just want to summarize a couple of things and maybe put the exclamation point on it. The first is I really do recommend that you print it out, go through it, and pull out those pieces that you know will be most useful and put them in a binder, and then add to them any internal policies that you think are also, in a sense, part of your own JCRC's guide, so that it really feels like it's your guide. The second thing is to let Melanie or me know if there's missing pieces. That is to say, this is really nice to have, but it's only 303 pages, and you missed these 6 things. So when you do an update, could you include these? And the fact of the matter is this guide already has been updated with 2 additional pieces that we added since February. It's very easy to do, and we want to be as responsive as we can. So I want to go back to something I said at the very beginning, and really put the exclamation point on it one more time. And that is to say that for me, the fact that we now have a guide, even if it's not printed in the most exquisite bound form, is really a statement about the seriousness with which JCPA takes strengthening the field, and it's a statement about how significant our field is within Jewish life. So for it to be a living, breathing, useful document is something I hope will be for all of you. And I'm glad that we had a lovely turnout on the phone today. The people stayed with it, and I do hope that it's been useful. And even if you don't have ideas for additions, if you have feedback on this webinar, please let Melanie or me know. And most importantly, if there are specific areas that you would want us to drill down on a future webinar, only on board responsibilities, only on structures of the JCRC, only on the Jewish values that underpin our work. If you think that a webinar would be worthwhile on any of the individual areas, then please let us know. So thank you from me. Melanie, any last words?
I want to thank everyone for coming on board, and I hopefully, we're really on the pulse of where you are right now. We're receiving a lot of calls from many of you, and it is our pleasure, and we are here to really help you as you're working on your boards and your structure and trying to make the case for the community relations field. It is our #1 priority to strengthen and advocate for the field. And any suggestions to us as how we can do it better, we're very open, and please feel free to contact us at any time. We're happy to share our expertise and what's happening in other parts of the community relations world.
Great. And as a very last word, I just want to add that there are additional resources. One is, of course, the listserv, which is used, I think, very effectively by colleagues when you have a particular issue. So don't be shy in that regard. The second is the staff of JCPA that is so very committed and that I've had a pleasure of working with in this area. The third is you will see some documents within the guidebook from a place called BoardSource, which is one of the best go-tos for nonprofit governance and management, and I want to commend that site to you. There is a membership fee, but it's a sliding scale based on the budget of an organization, and maybe it's something that the Federation already subscribes to and that you can access. And the fourth is colleagues in other arenas in the Jewish community who can be a valuable source in many of these areas as well. So just a quick note on that as an ending note. So thank you all so much for joining. And God only knows what's happened in the world during this past hour, but I'm sure all of us will be on top of it. So thank you.
I want to do a quick commercial for our CRC cast. I hope that everybody's getting the promotions for them. On March 17th, it's up on your screen, is our next one. Please feel free to promote this initiative widely to your entire federation, to your boards. We're trying to get high-level speakers to you. It's something that has been requested of us so that you can bring programming and education to the local level. And here we're bringing it right to your computer screens. So we look forward to seeing you on March 17th, and thanks for tuning in.